Marcus Harris, this is the police! Come out with your hands up! Do it now!
Hands high! Keep them
Down
up!
on your knees! Do it!
Okay.
The evening air hung heavy over Creekside, Georgia, a modest suburban community nestled about 30 miles southwest of Atlanta. The kind of place where neighbors still waved at each other from their driveways and children rode bicycles down quiet streets until the streetlights flickered on. It was the sort of town where people moved to escape the chaos of the city, to find peace, to raise families in relative tranquility. But on the night of June 14th, 2025, that peace would be shattered for one family in a way that would expose the terrifying fragility of constitutional rights in America. Marcus Thompson stood in his kitchen that evening, his mind racing with the kind of anxious thoughts that had plagued him for months. At 34 years old, he had worked hard to build a life for his family. He was an automotive technician at a dealership about 20 minutes away, the kind of job that kept his hands calloused but paid the bills and provided health insurance for his wife and their 2 young daughters. The modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Willow Creek Drive represented everything he had worked for since dropping out of community college to take care of his ailing mother years ago. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was his. Every payment made on time, every repair done himself to save money, every sacrifice made to keep his family secure within these walls. But lately, the stress had been mounting. Hours at the dealership had been cut, bills were piling up, and the arguments with his wife, Denise, had become more frequent, more heated. Not violent, never violent, but loud. The kind of arguments that left both of them feeling hollow and ashamed afterward. The kind that made Marcus wonder if the pressure of trying to hold everything together was slowly pulling them apart. That evening had been particularly difficult. A disagreement about finances had escalated into something uglier, with raised voices and accusations that neither of them truly meant. At some point during the argument, Denise had retreated to the bedroom and Marcus had stayed in the kitchen trying to calm himself down. He had pulled out his legally owned handgun from the cabinet where he kept it, not to threaten anyone, but simply to move it to a more secure location. He was a responsible gun owner, had been for years, and in moments of high emotion, his instinct was always to ensure the firearm was properly secured. But Denise had seen the gun in his hands through the doorway, and in her heightened emotional state, something in her had panicked. Without saying a word to Marcus, she had picked up her phone and dialed 911. If you have ever wondered how quickly a person's life can unravel, how a single moment can set in motion a chain of events that will cost someone their freedom, their livelihood, and their faith in the system that is supposed to protect them, then stay with me through this entire story. What happened to Marcus Thompson over the following months is a case study in everything that can go wrong when those in power choose not to verify the truth, when a system built on the presumption of innocence operates instead on the presumption of guilt, and when a single word, misheard or deliberately misrepresented, can destroy a man's life. The first patrol car arrived at the Thompson residence at approximately 8:47 in the evening. The June sky was just beginning to darken, that transitional time when shadows grow long and the last golden light of day gives way to the purple hues of dusk. Officer Rebecca Hartwell was the first on scene, a patrol officer with the Creekside Police Department, who had been with the force for about 6 years. She was followed shortly by her partner for the evening, Officer Dale McKinnon, a younger officer with just under 3 years on the job. The call had come in as a domestic disturbance with a possible weapon involved. For any law enforcement officer, such calls carry an inherent tension. Domestic situations are notoriously unpredictable, emotionally charged environments where anything can happen. The mention of a weapon only elevates that tension further. So it was understandable that Officers Hartwell and McKinnon approached the Thompson residence with heightened awareness, their training kicking in as they assessed the scene. What they found when they arrived was not, however, a crisis in progress. Denise Thompson was standing on the front lawn, visibly upset but unharmed. She had already calmed down considerably since making the call, and when the officers approached her, she was almost apologetic. She explained that she and her husband had been arguing, that she had seen him with his gun in the kitchen, and that she had panicked. She admitted that he had not pointed it at her, had not threatened her, had not done anything aggressive with the weapon. She had simply been scared in the moment. The officers took her statement and then approached the house. They wanted to speak with Marcus to get his side of the story, to ensure that the situation was indeed as calm as Denise was now claiming. This is standard procedure in domestic calls. Even when one party insists everything is fine, officers are trained to verify independently to make sure no one is being coerced or threatened into minimizing a dangerous situation. But Marcus Thompson was not interested in speaking with the police that evening. And here is where we need to understand something crucial about constitutional rights in America. Marcus was under no legal obligation to speak with them. He was inside his own home. He had not been accused of a crime. The officers did not have a warrant. And in the United States of America, a citizen has the absolute right to remain in their home and refuse to engage with law enforcement absent a warrant or exigent circumstances. Marcus knew this. He had educated himself on his rights years ago, not because he was a troublemaker or had anything to hide, but because he believed that every American should understand the Constitution that governs their relationship with the state. So when Officer Hartwell stepped onto his front porch and called out to him, asking him to come outside and talk, Marcus declined. He did not do so rudely at first. Through the closed front door, he simply stated that he was not going to speak with them without a warrant. He asked them to leave his property. Officer Hartwell, perhaps frustrated by his refusal to cooperate, perhaps simply following her training to try to resolve the situation, insisted that she did not need a warrant just to talk to him. This is technically true. Police officers can attempt to speak with anyone at any time. But what is also true is that citizens are equally free to decline that conversation. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted several minutes. The officers remained on and around the front porch. Marcus remained inside, periodically calling out for them to leave. His wife, Denise, who had by now been detained in the back of one of the patrol cars for her own disorderly conduct during the initial contact, could only watch helplessly as the situation she had inadvertently created continued to escalate. This is a moment worth pausing on, a moment that would become the fulcrum upon which Marcus Thompson's entire fate would pivot. Think about it from his perspective. You are in your own home. You have done nothing illegal. Your wife, in a moment of panic, called the police, but even she is now saying there is no threat, yet officers are standing on your property, demanding you come outside, and you absolutely know that you do not have to comply. What would you do? Would you assert your rights, or would you capitulate simply to avoid further conflict? If you have ever thought about this question, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It is a dilemma more Americans face than you might imagine. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus's patience wore thin. The officers were not leaving. They kept calling out to him, kept trying to engage him in conversation. And in his frustration, standing at a window near the front of the house, Marcus Thompson shouted words that would haunt him for the next several months of his life. He shouted for them to get away from his property. He shouted that if they did not leave, he would take legal action against their department. Specifically, the words that left his mouth, captured clearly on Officer McKinnon's body-worn camera, were these: "Get away from my house, or I will sue your department." Sue. S-U-E. A legal remedy, a civil action, the very foundation of how citizens in America seek redress against government overreach. Marcus Thompson, in a moment of frustration, threatened the most American thing possible, a lawsuit. But that is not what the officers would later claim they heard. The night eventually ended without further incident. The officers withdrew from the property. Denise Thompson was arrested for disorderly conduct, a charge that seemed almost punitive given the circumstances, a charge that felt more like retaliation for having wasted the officers' time than a genuine response to criminal behavior. She would be released on her own recognizance the following morning. Marcus, meanwhile, remained in his house with his two young daughters, a 6-year-old named Kayla and a 4-year-old named Maya. He put them to bed, kissed their foreheads, and tried to process everything that had just happened. He felt shaken, but also vindicated. He had asserted his rights. He had not been intimidated. He had done nothing wrong. He had no idea that the real nightmare was just beginning. The following day, June 15th, 2025, started like any other Saturday for the Thompson family. Marcus woke early, as he always did, a habit ingrained from years of early shifts at the dealership. He made coffee, checked on his daughters, and began to think about the day ahead. Denise had called from her sister's house where she had gone after being released. Their conversation had been tense but not hostile. They agreed to talk more when things had calmed down, to try to work through the issues that had brought them to this point. Marcus was just finishing his second cup of coffee when he heard it. The rumble of engines, multiple vehicles. He moved to the front window and felt his heart stop. There were 6 police cruisers parked along the street in front of his house. Officers were emerging from the vehicles, and they were not approaching casually. They were spreading out, taking positions. Several of them had their weapons drawn. For a moment, Marcus could not process what he was seeing. This had to be a mistake. They must be looking for someone else. There was no reason, no possible reason for this kind of response at his home. Then he heard his name being called through a loudspeaker. "Marcus Thompson, this is the Creekside Police Department. We have a warrant for your arrest. Come to the front door with your hands raised. You need to exit the residence immediately." Marcus's mind raced. A warrant? For what? What could he possibly have done that would justify this response? His daughters were in their bedrooms. His 6-year-old was already awake, had already appeared in the hallway, asking why there were so many cars outside. The fear in her voice cut through Marcus like a knife. "Go to your room, baby," he told her, trying to keep his voice calm. "Take your sister and stay in your room. Everything is going to be okay. Daddy just needs to talk to some people." Outside, the officers had taken up tactical positions. Several had their firearms trained on the windows of the house. The morning sun glinted off their weapons. Neighbors had begun to emerge onto their porches, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mixture of curiosity and alarm. Inside, Marcus was desperately trying to understand what was happening. He moved to the side door that led to the carport, opening it slightly to call out to the officers. "What is this about?" he shouted. "What warrant? What am I supposed to have done?" An officer he did not recognize shouted back, "You are under arrest for terrorist threats. You need to come out with your hands up. Do it now." Terrorist threats. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Terrorist threats. He had never threatened anyone. He had never. And then it clicked. The previous night, his words to the officers. But he had not threatened them. He had threatened to sue them. There was a difference. A massive difference. A difference that should have been obvious to anyone who had been there, to anyone who had heard him clearly, to anyone who had watched the footage from the body cameras that every officer present had been wearing. What would you do in this moment? You know you are innocent. You know that whatever they think happened did not actually happen, but there are armed officers outside your home pointing weapons at windows behind which your children are hiding. Do you try to explain? Do you resist? Do you comply and trust that the system will sort out the truth? It is an impossible situation, and it is a situation that no American citizen should ever have to face based on a lie. Marcus made the only choice that a loving father could make in that moment. He chose to protect his children by ensuring the situation did not escalate further. He stepped outside with his hands raised above his head, palms open and visible. The next several minutes were a blur of shouted commands and physical compliance. Officers ordered him to keep his hands up, to walk toward them, to turn around, to walk backward, to get on his knees. He complied with every command, even as the injustice of the situation burned in his chest. He was forced to his knees on his own driveway, the concrete rough against his skin, his hands placed behind his head as an officer approached to handcuff him. And then, as the metal clicked shut around his wrists, Officer Rebecca Hartwell appeared in his field of vision. The same officer who had been on his porch the night before. The same officer who had heard his words clearly. The same officer who knew, or should have known, exactly what he had said. "You are being arrested for making terrorist threats against law enforcement," she said, her voice carrying no particular emotion. Marcus could not believe what he was hearing. "Terrorist threats?" he repeated. "I told you I was going to sue your department." "Sue?" I said sue. "You have that on video. All of you were wearing cameras." Officer Hartwell's expression did not change. "That is not what we heard," she said simply. "Then check your cameras," Marcus insisted. "The footage will show exactly what I said. I threatened to file a lawsuit. That is not a crime. You can explain all of that in court," another officer said, pulling Marcus to his feet. "I need to see the warrant," Marcus demanded. I have a right to see the warrant and the affidavit. I need to see what you claimed I did. You will get all of that at your arraignment, came the reply. As they led Marcus toward a waiting patrol car, he twisted around, looking back at his house. His daughters' faces were pressed against the window of their bedroom, their eyes wide with terror, watching their father being taken away in handcuffs. The image would haunt Marcus for a long time afterward, the image of his babies, scared and confused, watching as police officers treated their daddy like a dangerous criminal. My kids are in there, Marcus said, his voice breaking. Someone needs to stay with my kids. Child Services is being notified, an officer responded. They will be taken care of. Child Services. The words sent a new wave of terror through Marcus. What if they took his children? What if this situation, already spiraling out of control, cost him not just his freedom, but his family? In that moment, sitting in the back of a patrol car, handcuffs cutting into his wrists, watching his home recede in the distance as his daughters' faces disappeared from the window, Marcus Thompson felt the full weight of what it means to be powerless against a system that has decided you are guilty, no matter what the evidence says, no matter what the truth is, no matter what your rights are supposed to be. The ride to the county detention center took about 25 minutes. For Marcus, it felt like hours. He sat in the back of the cruiser, his mind racing through everything that had happened, everything that could happen, everything that he needed to do to prove his innocence. The warrant. He needed to see the warrant, the affidavit. He needed to know exactly what they had claimed, what lie they had told to convince a judge to sign off on this arrest, because it had to be a lie. There was no other explanation. He had not threatened to shoot anyone. He had not threatened any violence whatsoever. He had asserted his constitutional right to be left alone on his own property and had warned them that he would pursue legal remedies if they continued to harass him. That is not a crime. That has never been a crime. That is, in fact, the very essence of what it means to be a free citizen in a country governed by laws rather than by the arbitrary whims of those in power. The booking process was degrading in the way that all booking processes are designed to be. Fingerprints, photographs, personal belongings confiscated, clothes exchanged for a jumpsuit. Every step a reminder that the system has claimed ownership of your body, your time, your dignity. Marcus cooperated fully, not because he accepted the legitimacy of what was happening, but because he understood that resistance at this stage would only make things worse. When he finally had access to a phone, he called Denise. She was hysterical. She had already heard about the arrest. Their daughters had been taken by Child Services and placed temporarily with her sister. She was on her way to try to regain custody. Marcus tried to comfort her, tried to assure her that this would all be sorted out, that the footage would clear him. But even as he said the words, a cold doubt had begun to form in the pit of his stomach. The footage. It existed. It was clear. It proved his innocence beyond any shadow of a doubt. But what if no one watched it? What if the system simply did not care? Marcus would spend the next 3 days in the county jail awaiting his bond hearing. 3 days in which the world outside continued to turn without him. 3 days in which his employers at the dealership, having received no explanation for his absence, terminated his employment. 3 days in which his daughters cried themselves to sleep every night, asking their aunt when their daddy was coming home. 3 days in which the lie that had been told about him began to solidify into official record, taking on a life of its own, becoming harder and harder to dislodge. On the 3rd day, Marcus was brought before a judge for his initial appearance. This was when he finally saw the document that had destroyed his life. The arrest warrant, supported by an affidavit signed by Officer Rebecca Hartwell, stated that on the night of June 14th, Marcus Thompson had, quote, threatened to shoot law enforcement officers while they were attempting to conduct a welfare check at his residence. Threatened to shoot, not threatened to sue. Shoot. Marcus stared at the words, reading them again and again, as if repetition might somehow change them. This was not a mistake. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate fabrication. Officer Hartwell had stood on his porch. She had heard his words clearly enough to repeat them back at the time, to confirm with her partner what he had said. And now, in an official document submitted to a court of law, she had changed one word that transformed a lawful exercise of constitutional rights into a felony crime. The bond was set at $15,000. Marcus's family scrambled to come up with the 10% required by a bail bondsman. It took another day before he was released. 4 days total that he had spent incarcerated for a crime he had not committed, a crime that had never actually occurred, a crime that existed only in the false narrative constructed by officers who had decided that his defiance required punishment. If you are watching this and you believe that the justice system in America is fundamentally fair, that innocent people have nothing to fear from law enforcement, that the truth always comes out in the end, then I want you to understand something. The truth does not come out on its own. The truth does not defend itself. The truth requires someone to fight for it, to demand that it be heard, to refuse to accept the convenient lies that those in power would prefer to substitute for reality. And even then, even when someone fights as hard as Marcus Thompson would fight in the months to come, there is no guarantee that the truth will prevail. What would you do if you found yourself in this situation? If you knew you were innocent, if you had proof of your innocence, but the very people who were supposed to discover that proof had already decided you were guilty? Let me know in the comments how you think you would handle it. The weeks following Marcus's release were a special kind of torment. He was out of jail, yes, but he was not free. A felony charge hung over his head: terrorist threats. Under Georgia law, that charge carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years in state prison. 5 years for saying that he was going to sue someone. And the system, it seemed, was in no hurry to examine the evidence that would have immediately resolved the matter. Marcus had hired an attorney, a public defender initially, and then, after scraping together every dollar his family could muster, a private criminal defense lawyer named Patricia Holloway. She was experienced in cases involving police misconduct, and she was optimistic that the body camera footage would quickly resolve the matter. Once the prosecutor sees the footage, they will have to dismiss, she assured Marcus. No reasonable prosecutor is going to take this to trial when there is video evidence directly contradicting the officer's account. But that optimism rested on an assumption that would prove tragically misplaced. The assumption that anyone in the prosecutor's office would actually watch the footage. Days turned into weeks. The arraignment came and went. Marcus pleaded not guilty. Discovery requests were filed. Patricia submitted motions demanding the body camera footage be produced and reviewed. At every stage, she expected the case to collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. At every stage, she was disappointed. The weeks turned into months. Summer faded into fall. Marcus, unable to find new employment with a pending felony charge, worked odd jobs under the table to help support his family. His relationship with Denise, already strained before the incident, had somehow grown stronger through the shared adversity, but the stress was taking its toll on both of them. They had lost sleep. They had lost money. They had lost faith in everything they had once believed about fairness and justice. And then, in September of 2025, something happened that seemed almost too cruel to be real. The case was presented to a grand jury, and the grand jury returned an indictment. Let me explain what this means for those who might not be familiar with the criminal justice process. A grand jury is a group of citizens convened to determine whether there is probable cause to formally charge someone with a crime. Unlike a trial jury, which determines guilt or innocence, a grand jury only decides whether there is enough evidence to proceed with a prosecution. The standard is low. The proceedings are secret. The accused has no right to be present, no right to present evidence, no right to cross-examine witnesses. There is a saying among lawyers that a skilled prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. The grand jury process is so heavily tilted in favor of the prosecution that an indictment is almost inevitable once a case is presented. The prosecutor controls what evidence the grand jury sees. The prosecutor controls what witnesses testify. The prosecutor controls the narrative. And in Marcus Thompson's case, apparently, no one thought it necessary to show the grand jury the body camera footage that would have instantly revealed the entire prosecution to be based on a lie. The indictment hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. He had allowed himself to believe, to hope, that the system would correct itself before things went this far. An indictment meant he was facing a formal felony charge. An indictment meant he was heading toward trial. An indictment meant that someone somewhere in the prosecutor's office had looked at this case and decided it was worth pursuing, decided that Marcus Thompson belonged in prison, decided that a man who had threatened nothing more than a lawsuit deserved to have his life destroyed. Patricia Holloway was as shocked as her client. "I cannot understand it," she told him. "The footage is clear. There is no ambiguity." How could they present this case to a grand jury without reviewing the primary piece of evidence? The answer, as Marcus would eventually learn, was simple and devastating. They never watched it. No one in the entire chain of command, from the arresting officers to the prosecutor who presented the case, had bothered to review the body camera footage. They had simply accepted the sworn statement of Officer Rebecca Hartwell at face value. They had assumed that a law enforcement officer would not lie in an official document. They had failed, at every step, to perform the most basic due diligence that the justice system demands. This is a failure that happens more often than any of us would like to believe. Every year, people are arrested, charged, indicted, and even convicted based on evidence that no one ever properly examined. Every year, lives are destroyed because overworked prosecutors take shortcuts, because police officers are given the benefit of the doubt even when that doubt should be profound, because the system processes people as if they were widgets on an assembly line rather than human beings with rights that deserve protection. Marcus Thompson had become one of those statistics, a name on a docket, a file on a desk, a case to be processed rather than a person to be protected. And so, in desperation, Marcus did something that would ultimately save him. He reached out to the media. Christina Martinez was an investigative reporter with WBCA News, a local television station that had built a reputation for holding local institutions accountable. She had covered stories of police misconduct before, had exposed corruption and incompetence in various county agencies, and had developed a particular interest in cases where body camera footage contradicted official narratives. When Marcus Thompson contacted her through a tip line, explaining his situation and offering to share the evidence that proved his innocence, she was immediately intrigued. "Walk me through what happened," she said when they first met at a coffee shop on the outskirts of town. She had a notebook open, a recorder running, and a look of focused intensity that told Marcus she took this seriously. He told her everything. The argument with his wife, the police response, his refusal to come outside without a warrant, his exact words shouted through the window, the arrest the following day, the warrant, the affidavit, the lie, the indictment. "And you have the body camera footage?" Christina asked. Marcus nodded. His attorney had finally obtained it through discovery. He had watched it dozens of times. Every viewing was simultaneously vindicating and infuriating. Vindicating because it proved, beyond any possible doubt, exactly what he had said. Infuriating because everyone who should have watched it had apparently declined to do so. Christina reviewed the footage that afternoon. She listened to it with headphones, played it back multiple times, isolated the relevant section, and had a colleague listen to it without any context to confirm that she was hearing what she thought she was hearing. The footage was unambiguous, crystal clear. Officer McKinnon's body camera had captured the moment perfectly. Marcus Thompson's voice, raised in frustration, calling out from inside his home, "Get away from my house or I will sue your department." Sue, not shoot. Sue. And then, immediately afterward, one of the officers repeating what they had heard, "Sue our department," is what he just said. It was right there. The officers themselves, in the immediate aftermath of the statement, had correctly identified the word Marcus had used. They had confirmed it. They had acknowledged it. And then, somehow, between that night and the following morning when they applied for an arrest warrant, the word had changed. Sue had become shoot. A legal threat had become a death threat, and no one had questioned it. Christina Martinez had her story. When WBCA News contacted the district attorney's office for comment, everything changed rapidly. The inquiry was straightforward. A reporter asking the prosecutor's office to review the body camera footage in the Thompson case in light of apparent discrepancies between the footage and the arrest warrant affidavit. The office's response was telling. They would review the matter and get back to the station. 4 days later, the charges against Marcus Thompson were dismissed. The prosecutor's office issued a brief statement indicating that upon closer review of the evidence, it had been determined that the evidence did not support the charges. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that a man had spent 4 days in jail, lost his job, faced months of uncertainty, and been indicted for a felony that he had never committed. Just a quiet dismissal, as if the whole thing had been a minor paperwork error rather than a systematic failure of justice. Marcus Thompson was a free man. But free from what? The charges were gone, but the damage remained. His job was gone. His savings were gone, depleted by legal fees and months of underemployment. His reputation in the community had been shattered. Neighbors who had watched him be led away in handcuffs still looked at him differently, still wondered if maybe there was something to the accusations after all. The trauma that his daughters had experienced, watching their father be taken away at gunpoint, could not be undismissed by a court order. And the officers who had caused all of this, they faced no consequences. Officer Rebecca Hartwell continued her patrol duties. Officer Dale McKinnon continued his patrol duties. No disciplinary action was announced. No perjury charges were filed. The lie that had destroyed Marcus Thompson's life for months was simply forgotten by the system that had empowered it. This is the part of the story that should make every American deeply uncomfortable, because in this country, we like to believe that there are checks and balances, that there are consequences for misconduct, that the truth matters, and justice ultimately prevails. But Marcus Thompson's story reveals a different reality, a reality in which an officer can swear to a false statement in an arrest warrant, can deprive a citizen of his liberty, his livelihood, and his peace of mind, and can face absolutely no repercussions when the lie is exposed. There is legal recourse, of course. The framework exists for Marcus Thompson to seek civil remedies for what was done to him. A Supreme Court case from the late 1970s established that when false information is included in an arrest warrant affidavit, either knowingly and intentionally or with reckless disregard for the truth, and when that false information was necessary for the finding of probable cause, then the warrant becomes invalid and everything that flows from it becomes a constitutional violation. Think about what that means. The arrest warrant in this case was only issued because of the claim that Marcus had threatened to shoot police officers. If the affidavit had accurately stated that he threatened to sue the department, no judge would have found probable cause for terroristic threats, because there would have been no threat. The lie was not incidental. The lie was the entire foundation of the case. Whether Officer Hartwell deliberately falsified her account or simply demonstrated a reckless disregard for accuracy does not ultimately matter under the law. Either scenario represents a violation of Marcus Thompson's Fourth Amendment rights. Either scenario should result in civil liability. Either scenario should result in meaningful consequences. But should and will are different words in the American justice system. Filing a civil rights lawsuit is expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. Even with clear evidence of misconduct, police officers enjoy qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that protects government officials from civil liability unless their conduct violated clearly established law. Departments fight these cases vigorously. The process can take years, and even if Marcus prevails, no amount of money can fully compensate for what he lost: his job, his savings, his sense of security in his own home, his daughter's innocence shattered by the image of armed officers pointing weapons at their families' windows, his belief that if you do the right thing, if you know your rights and exercise them peacefully, the system will protect you. That belief was the real casualty here, because Marcus Thompson did everything right. He stayed in his home. He refused to submit to demands that the officers had no authority to make. He asserted his constitutional rights clearly and loudly. He threatened nothing more than the legal remedy that every American citizen is entitled to pursue. And for that, the system tried to destroy him. It would have succeeded too, if not for two things: the existence of body camera footage that no one bothered to watch, and the persistence of a journalist who cared enough to listen. What does this story tell us about justice in America? It tells us that rights, on paper, mean nothing if the people tasked with protecting them choose not to do so. It tells us that technology like body cameras, heralded as tools of accountability, are only useful if someone actually reviews the footage they capture. It tells us that a system which processes human beings like widgets on an assembly line will inevitably crush some of those humans in its gears. It tells us that the phrase "innocent until proven guilty" is, for many Americans, a cruel fiction. Marcus Thompson survived his ordeal. His family stayed together. He eventually found new employment. His daughters, with time and therapy, began to heal from the trauma they had witnessed. Life went on as life does even after injustice. But he was one of the lucky ones. Lucky that there was footage. Lucky that the footage was clear. Lucky that a journalist took his call. Lucky that the media exposure forced the system to do what it should have done from the beginning. How many Marcus Thompsons are there who were not so lucky? How many are sitting in prison right now, convicted of crimes they did not commit, their protests of innocence falling on deaf ears? How many have given up, have accepted plea deals for crimes they never committed, simply because they could not afford the risk of trial, could not afford an attorney who would fight for them, could not afford to believe that the truth would set them free when their own experience told them otherwise? These are the questions that this story should leave us with. These are the questions that demand answers. And so, as we reach the end of Marcus Thompson's story, I want to pose one final question to you, the viewer. What would you have done if you found yourself in Marcus's position, standing in your own kitchen, facing officers who had no warrant and no authority to command your presence? Would you have known your rights? Would you have had the courage to assert them? And if asserting those rights led to the nightmare that Marcus experienced, would you have had the resilience to fight back, to seek out the evidence that proved your innocence, to refuse to let the system's failure become your permanent punishment? These are not hypothetical questions. Every day in cities and towns across America, people face situations like this. Every day, someone has to make the choice between compliance and conviction. Every day, the gap between the rights we are promised and the rights we are actually permitted to exercise becomes visible in the most painful possible ways. If this story has affected you, if it has made you think about the fragility of the freedoms we take for granted, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel for more stories that reveal the truth about how power operates in America. These are the stories that the system does not want you to hear, but they are the stories that every citizen needs to understand. Because our rights do not end where fear begins. Because the Constitution is not a suggestion. Because freedom, real freedom, requires vigilance, courage, and the willingness to fight for what is right, even when the system insists you should surrender. Marcus Thompson fought. He won. But the battle for justice in America is far from over, and it is a battle that belongs to all of us.